Welcome, everyone, and welcome back to our Migrations Initiative Spring 2022 series. I'm Eleanor Painter, postdoctoral associate in migrations with the Mario Einaudi Center for International Studies, and it's such a pleasure to welcome you all here for today's interdisciplinary roundtable discussion of migration and notions of invasion through work across species. We've got a really fabulous panel today, including Christopher Dunn, David Lodge, Natasha Raheja, and Wendy Wilford. And we have Anurag Agrawal moderating, and I'll let him give more detailed introductions in just a moment. As we begin, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that Cornell University is located on the traditional homelands of the Gayukono, the Cayuga Nation. The Gayukono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of Gayukono dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of Gayukono people, past and present, to these lands and waters. And so we open with this acknowledgement of dispossession here, where many of us are located. And I also want to acknowledge that, of course, we planned this panel before we could know what would be unfolding in Ukraine. And now we find ourselves taking up questions of invasion in a moment when this concept feels, unfortunately, especially relevant and urgent. And one of the things that becomes clear as we watch Russia's attacks in Ukraine is how the language of invasion, on the one hand, or occupation on the other, is tied to social and political realities and to competing narratives, and also to life and death stakes. And we see this in questions around Russian forces in Ukraine, but there's also a lot of discussion, of course, about the flight of Ukrainians out of the country and the important welcoming of Ukrainians in countries across Europe contrasts with the common language of threat and invasion so often used to describe instead the arrival of people from Africa or the Middle East to these same countries. So this is on my mind, certainly as we begin this discussion today. But of course, this language isn't confined to the context of human migration. And so I'm really looking forward to the chance to hear from today's panelists on how notions of invasion and the questions it raises resonate, perhaps, when we think across fields and across species. Where are the alignments and where are there frictions in our understandings of migration and ideas of invasion, or as the panel has been called, of outsiders and outsiderness? What different questions might we ask about migration and ideas of threat or risk when informed by this kind of multi-species conversation? Many thanks to the eCornell team for producing today's event and this series, and please keep an eye out for our next event on March 21st, when we'll focus on representing migration in theater productions and arts engagement initiatives with speakers from Ithaca's own Cherry Arts group. And thanks again to you all for being with us today. And I'll now hand it over to today's moderator, Professor Anurag Agrawal, the James A. Perkins Professor of Environmental Studies in Cornell University's Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, as well as Faculty Fellow of the Cornell Atkinson Center for Sustainability. Professor Agrawal's research melds questions on the ecology and evolution of interactions between wild plants and their insect pests, including aspects of community interactions, chemical ecology, coevolution, and the monarch life cycle. Thanks so much for moderating today's roundtable, and I will now hand it over to you.
Thanks so much, Eleanor. It's great to be here. I'm exceedingly pleased to be moderating this panel discussion, especially with such distinguished panelists and speakers. I'm going to very briefly introduce them and just have a couple of words, and then we'll hear from each of the panelists, and we'll have Q&A after the 4 presentations. I'm going to introduce them in the reverse order from which they'll be speaking. So Wendy Wilford, who is the Vice Provost of International Affairs and also from the Department of Global Development, will be speaking and presenting last. Then we have Natasha Raheja from Anthropology, David Lodge, who is the director of the Cornell Atkinson Center for Sustainability, and Christopher Dunn, who is the director of the Cornell Botanical Gardens. And in this remarkable group of scholars, we have expertise ranging from the detection of aquatic invasive species, the movement of plants and their conservation, the movement of human societies and social movements, as well as legal and visual anthropology as it relates to human migration. So it's a tremendously diverse but interconnected group of people that Eleanor said perhaps share a common lexicon, although that may be used in different ways. Migration, movement, invasion has certainly been on our minds, and as an ecologist myself, I was aware that last week was also the North American Invasive Species Awareness Week. So it's kind of all around us, and there's no time like the present to get into it. I guess the last thing I'd say is, I think our discussion is going to be really interesting, and I guess there will be, and we're compelled to struggle with some of the semantic issues, given that we use some of the same language. But I'm quite hopeful that we will also get down to some of the substantive overlapping issues and those that don't overlap in terms of discussing movement, migration, and invasion in the human as well as, let's say, wildlife context. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker, David Lodge. Each of the speakers will present for 7 to 10 minutes, and we will flow from one to the next, and then open it up to Q&A from the audience, which will be filtering in through the chat, and hopefully have a lively discussion at that point. So David, if you will, please go ahead.
Terrific. Thank you, Anurag. So I come to this topic of outsiders as a scientist, a biologist to be specific, and I've been engaged on the science, policy, and management of invasive species for over 30 years. Mostly that's been in the context of U.S. federal policy and U.S. state policies and Canadian provincial policies in the Great Lakes region of North America. My own research on this topic is also very resonant with my role as director of the Cornell Atkinson Center for Sustainability, because the mission of Cornell Atkinson is to bring knowledge to impact on public policy, corporate practices, or products, and public opinion. So, in my research and practice domain, if you will, as a scientist, the context of invasions is this. The natural range of a species is determined by climate and other characteristics of the environment, the evolutionary history of an organism, and the geographic barriers to dispersal of that species, things like mountain ranges, deserts, rivers, and oceans. But humans have been moving species outside their native range since humans started migrating long distances. What is quantitatively different in our modern world is the forces of globalization that have driven a dramatically accelerated rate of movements of humans and their goods in transportation networks of planes and ships that link every place on the planet with every other place on the planet with just a few degrees of separation. And those humans and goods all often bring along with them the many other species that have concerned biologists like me. One consequence of that is this intentional and unintentional transport of species beyond their native ranges. And it's just happening at orders of magnitude greater rates than it was just a few decades ago. That's the concern. And some of these species have caused great harm to agriculture, ecosystems, and human health. So that's the conceptual context. Now, I also want to introduce sort of the policy context, and I'll focus here on U.S. policy, but it's not that different from the policies of many other nations. And the key components of defining the species that are often targets of policy and management, including prohibition and other management, are twofold. One is that they are alien species. Synonyms for that, in my context, of practice are non-native or non-indigenous. And I'll mostly use non-indigenous from here on out, but alien is the term that is enshrined in US policy. And so what we mean by that is the species that are outside the boundaries that were determined by climate and evolution. They're outside what is often called by biologists their natural range. In other words, they've been introduced outside their native range by human activity. So that's the first concept. They're outside their native range and they got there with human help. The second defining feature of the species that are the targets of policy and management is that not only are they non-indigenous, but they do or are likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. So they're harmful. And the goal of US policy, which is too rarely achieved, is to prevent harm to humans directly, like human health, and to prevent harm to the things that humans value, including biodiversity, forestry, agriculture, and the health of aquatic ecosystems. Now, abundant research shows that the most effective way to reduce that harm is to prevent the introduction of non-indigenous species that are likely to be harmful in the first place. We are rarely successful at that. When we fail at that, as we often do, the second best approach, which is the one that we're usually doing, is to try to manage the non-indigenous invasive species to reduce their harm. So to illustrate these concepts, these definitions, let me provide some specific examples just to make sure we're sort of all on the same page. First, let me give you some examples of species that are non-indigenous in North America, but they're not invasive, at least not generally considered to be invasive. Cows, pigs, at least the ones that haven't escaped cultivation, soybeans, wheat, lots of ornamental plants, ornamental magnolia trees and shrubs from Asia, for example, but lots of other plants and animals are non-indigenous, but not invasive. The species, rather, that we're concerned about are those that are non-indigenous and invasive or harmful. I'll give you some examples of that. Viruses that cause measles and smallpox that arrived with Europeans in North America. The SARS-CoV-2 virus that causes COVID-19 in humans, and we're learning also in several species of wildlife, brought to North America, as we all now know, in human travelers. Multiple species of rats, which arrived on ships or otherwise with people, that are tremendously destructive in agriculture and elsewhere. Zebra mussels, little clams that clog up water infrastructure and disrupt freshwater ecosystems, brought to North America in the ballast water of ships. They're still spreading across North America. Silver carp, a fish that disrupts freshwater ecosystems, injures people by jumping out of the water and colliding with people, reduces recreational opportunities. And this species was intentionally introduced into sewage treatment and aquaculture ponds and escaped and is still spreading. Emerald ash borer, an insect that arrived in wooden packing material on ships that will eventually kill most of the ash trees in North America, including many on Cornell property and in my yard in Ithaca. Japanese knotweed, a plant that crowds out native plants and was intentionally introduced as an ornamental plant and is still spreading fast. Lots of agricultural weeds and insect pests and other pests on which we deploy herbicides and pesticides annually. Finally, a final example, Burmese pythons, big snakes that are still spreading northward from southern Florida and reducing the abundance of native small mammals as they go, reducing them up to 90% in the Everglades as an example. They've also killed snake owners and the children of snake owners. They were imported in the pet trade. So I meant to just, with that list of examples, meant to give you a sort of diversity of kinds of organisms and the different ways in which they got to North America. There are thousands of non-indigenous species in North America, and in aggregate, those non-indigenous invasive species cost the US hundreds of billions of dollars annually And that was true even before COVID-19. We all know the costs of COVID-19 are still being felt and yet to be tallied. So we have lots of stories of harm from invasive species. There are also some successes, increasingly so in recent decades. Ballast water policy has led to management of ballast water and treatment of ballast water that has reduced the introduction of thousands of coastal and freshwater species globally. Treatment of wood packing materials has reduced the introduction of things like emerald ash borer. And we have increasing successes of management after we've already let a species become established. We control, as I mentioned earlier, many agricultural pests with toxins or genetic engineering of the crops to make the crops more resistant. We use biocontrol to control the harmful fish alewife in the Great Lakes. We've used chemical control since 1955 to control sea lampreys in the Great Lakes. All these examples and many more have been driven by synergistic combinations of innovation in technology, policy innovation, and innovation in markets. However, a huge need exists for further innovation if U.S. policy and the policies of many other nations are to achieve their goals of reducing harm from invasive species. Our own work in my lab and with my collaborators is about using environmental DNA, applying sort of the equivalent of forensic DNA analysis to support environmental protection from invasive species. I want to conclude my comments by just hinting at some potentially confusing or even fraught aspects of what I've described so far. I won't elaborate at this point, but suggest that some of the terminology that I'm about to make a few more comments about and the implications of that terminology, these topics might be fruitful topics for question and answer and discussion later in the panel. So first, let me return to that term alien. That's been enshrined in US policy since 1999, but of course, we're all aware that it carries, when applied to humans, dehumanizing connotations. And it's led some critics of invasive species biology and management to accuse those of us involved in this of speciesism. A second term is the invasive term. As I've described, in a policy context, it hinges on a species having harm. But who judges that harm? How is it measured? What happens or should happen when human values change, or human values are different in different places, or they're different among different people in the same place? What other disciplines come into play, have come into play, or should come into play in defining and quantifying harm? And the last two comments I'll make both have to do with the notion of being introduced by human activity. This has prompted some critics to ask, well, why don't you see humans as part of what is natural? This leads some to suggest that we shouldn't be worried about any of this in the first place. And lastly, is climate change included in the concept of introduced by human activity? Should range expansions caused by changing climate prompt the same kind of policy and managed responses as other more immediate human activities, like just bringing over a Burmese python in the pet trade and letting them go? Do our attempts to protect biodiversity from climate change, which sometimes include moving species across barriers to a place with more favorable climate, should those efforts, for example, fall into the same set of concerns and policy oversight as I've described here? So I'll finish there, and I'm really looking forward to other panelists' comments and to the discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Thanks so much, David. We're going to move straight away to Christopher Dunn, who will speak of migration of another sort, assisted migration in plants. Thank you, Christopher.
Well, thank you very much, Anurag, for moderating this, and for Eleanor for organizing us together. It's a real pleasure to be here. And what I will talk about might be the flip side of what David Lodge was speaking to. And he sort of teed it up a little nicely for me. But rather than human activities resulting in the quote unquote invasion of non-native species into other regions, countries, and systems, what about the intentional movement of plants or seeds, ostensibly as a conservation strategy, to an area outside of their native range? But let's start with something that David referred to, which is climate change, a key component of what some call the Anthropocene, or where I come from, the Anthropocene. So climate and climate change can be illustrated in the form of hardiness zone maps, which are commonly used in horticulture and by home gardeners. Oops, I'm sorry. Whoops. Let's go back here. So these hardiness zone maps are developed by the US Department of Agriculture, the Arbor Day Foundation, and others. So here are two, 25 years apart. They issue new ones every so often. So if you look at New York, and I don't know if you can see my little white pointer, but Tompkins County would be about here in this dark green area, zone 5. Now, if you go to the new map from 2015, we're in this lighter green, which is zone 6. So Ithaca, New York has changed by a zone of hardiness in the mere 25 years. If you go to the nursery, big box stores, Home Depot or Lowe's, and you buy plants for your garden, there may be a label on there that says hardy in zones 5 and 6. Well, these zones are shifting. Just look at the cold zone, this dark zone in the northern tier of the United States in 1990 has almost virtually disappeared now. Well, look at the subtropical zone, the southern tip of Florida. That has rapidly expanded in the last 25 or 30 years. So plants may be adapted to one zone or another, or maybe two zones, but climate change is causing this to shift northward. So one of the questions is, can plants migrate at a rate that keeps up with climate change? For many woody species, the answer seems to be probably not, but not exclusively, probably not. A large amount of research was done early on by Margaret Davis at the University of Minnesota, looking at the rate of climate change and the rate of species' ability to move and migrate. Anyway, all of this will have significant impacts on biodiversity, increased risks of extinction and the like. And there are also significant secondary impacts on indigenous and local communities of this loss of biological diversity, losses of language and cultural diversity, which may be another topic for another time. So thus, climate change leads, as David Lodge was saying, to an increase in the number, perhaps, and impact of invasive species and invasiveness, and leads some conservation biologists and some well-meaning citizens to propose physically moving plants or their seeds or propagules to areas outside of their current native range. And this is referred to, and we can get into another terminological discussion, as David was introducing, on assisted migration or assisted colonization or assisted translocation. But the idea is that we are intentionally taking these seeds, these seedlings and propagules, and moving them elsewhere where we think or anticipate that we'll be more successful in the face of climate change. Now, of course, we can think of species ranges as being elastic. They expand and they contract as a result of climate, as a result of glaciation and other things that are happening on the landscape. But is assisted migration a stretch too far? Some are convinced that it's really the only way to save many native species, and others are convinced it's too risky to even tinker with that migration. So the poster child for a lot of this is Terea Taxifolia, a tree endemic to the panhandle of Florida. The common name is the Florida nutmeg yew. It has a very limited range, as shown here in that red stippled area, just barely crosses into Georgia, so the Georgians will claim it's a native plant in Georgia. Climate models suggest that a more suitable temperature moisture regime for this Terea Taxifolia might be found further north. Thus, it has been suggested that Terea be physically translocated. So this, to one extent, assumes that it will not survive in Northwest Florida, and we don't know that. But some public citizens who self-named themselves the Terea Guardians have been collecting seeds from these native populations, as well as from botanic gardens and arboreta throughout the US, which is shown on their collection site shown on the left. Then on the right, some of the sites in which they are reintroducing or establishing, not reintroducing, but establishing these individuals. And one of the leaders of this, shown here on the left, Connie Barlow, who's taken upon herself and her colleagues to anthropomorphize these plants. They're all given now names and nicknames. So woe be anyone who tries to tinker with them. And I should mention that Terea is federal listed as endangered. It has been since 1984 and is critically endangered by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, or IUCN. It's actually illegal to collect from wild populations of the species, and even more so to plant them anywhere else. Nonetheless, these Terea gardens are doing such. So let's think for a moment about the nature of nature. So is nature more like this, a monoculture or a plantation of a single species or crop? Or more like this, with a diversity of plants, mammals, reptiles, insects, soil organisms, etc., and all the myriad interactions that occur among organisms and their environment. Someone once said that ecology is not more complex than you think, it is more complex than you can think. And so whatever we do will have unintended consequences. So what might happen if we completely remove one species or two species or three species from this forest? What might happen if we introduce a new species into that context or two species into that context? Now, introduced species might not survive because they are not adapted to the local climate, the local soils. This is a very overview of soil diversity in the United States. They may be completely unsuited for that environment. Just to show the complexity of soil types, this is a soil map of New York State, and you can see you don't have to move very far before you go from one soil type to another. So plants may not survive well because they're not adapted to that physical environment. Plants might do too well and become locally invasive or a nuisance of some sort. The plants might do well, but bring in or attract other pests with them or other risks, such as fire or whatever, or diseases, putting other species at risk. And it's known that plants alter the soil biology and chemistry of the site in which they are, in which they exist. And to what extent might that, an introduced species, alter the soil environment to such an extent that it's no longer suitable for the native species that were already there? And we know that some invasive species, such as garlic mustard and buckthorn and others, do alter the soil chemistry and biology of the sites in which they've now occur. Now, there are no widely or even regionally accepted policies on assisted migration or assisted colonization. Some colleagues with IUCN and with other major NGOs are proposing that a global policy be established and that IUCN and the Convention on Biological Diversity ensure that such policies are developed and implemented. And some recommendations were published about a year ago in Science, and they used here, the example of Terea in their paper. And so they came up with a number of policies that have been published or proposed policies. Researchers at Oregon State University have also suggested principles on this topic. But where do we go from here, since we don't really have any guidelines or guideposts? And what is migration in an ecological and conservation context? And if assisted migration, that is helping out refugees from other countries, if assisted migration is appropriate in a human context, why not in an ecological one? Do we take the risk? Or do we wait for more research and policies, which also has risks in terms of the time that we have to wait to better understand? So I'm going to leave it with questions. And thank you very much for the invitation to be here, and hand it back to Anurag.
Christopher, thank you very much. We're going to move to the third speaker, Professor Natasha Raheja from Anthropology at Cornell. Natasha, go ahead.
Thank you, Arun, and thank you, Eleanor, for bringing us together. I'm going to shift registers a bit and address some of the questions that David and Christopher left us with, and talk about some of the ways that scholars in sociocultural anthropology and the environmental humanities approach the question of migration and invasion, where some of us call into question the orthodoxy of native and non-native or non-indigenous and invasive species. And I'm going to discuss the language of invasion in the context of my research in South Asia, not only as a semantic question, but as a question that has material consequences. So rather than assessing what beings fit where, This approach asks how certain taxonomies and classifications come to be in ways that are not neutral and often may center the interest of specific stakeholders. So in the case of human migration, which I'm going to talk more about today, how specifically is the language of invasion being invoked to demarcate and reify social groups of people as insiders and outsiders, and accordingly characterize movements as justified or unjustified, or as harmful or unharmful? So, for example, as Eleanor spoke to, what is the political context that shapes the way that the US news media and state actors speak of migration happening either because of invasion, as is the current case with mainstream American coverage of Russia and Ukraine, or speaking of migration as invasion, as is the case in the state rhetoric in Texas, which is where I grew up, where the governor and border vigilantes speak of migrants from Mexico and Central America as invaders and pest. And the language of pestilence is a site where we get to start to see some of the overlaps between these separate idealized worlds of animals and humans. So the problem is that invasion here is a value-laden term, and it presupposes the foreignness of a given being and the a priori or pre-existing integrity of a habitat and closed ecosystems. And I don't suggest that we do away with the term, but rather understand how the language of invasion is being deployed and what are the material consequences that it yields for all beings. So the critique is less about the actual word, but more about drawing attention to a set of power relations. Who's calling whom invasive and to what end, and what are the stakes involved? So keeping this framework and the inter and multi-species spirit of this convening in mind, I'm going to talk first about the relevance of this conversation in the context of migration and cross-border movement of both humans and human animals and insects in my own field site, which is now in southern Pakistan and western India. And I've been conducting fieldwork there for the past decade. And then I'll briefly contemplate two broader questions. The first question that I'll contemplate is how we naturalize borders for humans and non-human animals differently. And by naturalize, I mean, how do borders for humans become second nature and taken for granted? And two, how does the non or more than human world, how can we learn from ecology for alternatives to the dominant nation state order that organizes humans? So in the context of my own research, I've been working with migrant population across Pakistan and India to understand how social groups transition between being part of minorities and majorities as they cross borders. And as part of this research, I was in the field in fall of 2019, and there were, at that time in India, there were parliamentary debates and rallies for a piece of citizenship amendment legislation that would tie religion to citizenship. And as part of this legislation, the Indian government was privileging a certain class of the population, Hindus, as insiders, and reifying Muslims as outsiders or non-Indigenous. So as part of the rallies in support of this legislation, Indian government officials were describing migrants as termites and infiltrators, or ghuspetia in Hindi, at right-wing political rallies across the country. And I'm not going to go into here the kind of longer history of bilateral hostility between India and Pakistan and Hindus and Muslims kind of has its provenance under colonial rule. So as I was in the field tracking this, and the kind of lead up to the passing of this legislation, at the same time, due to climate change and increasing moisture in rains that make very suitable locust egg hatching conditions, there was an intense ecological phenomenon unfolding in southern Pakistan and western India. At this time, thousands of gregarious desert locust swarms were flying across the India-Pakistan border and wreaking havoc for fields of farmers, ravaging their fields. And locust swarms can travel up to 80 miles in a day, and they can eat a single swarm can eat up to 200 tons of food in a day. So it was a very intensely felt crisis amongst farmers. There was a lot of insecurity. Many of the migrants that I work with are themselves agricultural laborers, and they started to wonder, why are these locusts crossing? Some of their rumors were that the locusts were perhaps bioweapons to destroy crops, and that they were bioweapons from other countries that were sent to affect the livelihoods of farmers in India. So the crisis and insecurity took on a nationalist idiom. And as I mentioned, many of the migrants were agricultural laborers themselves. And in some of the ways that I do research, which includes digital ethnography, I'm part of migrant WhatsApp groups. And I started to notice this outpouring of videos on these WhatsApp groups of locust swarms. And some of these videos anthropomorphize the locust, ascribing them nationality, calling the locust a woman, calling them a Pakistani woman that needed to stay out. In some of these videos, farmers were beheading locust, hanging locust. So I started to think about how locust and pest more broadly came to stand in for the figure of the migrant materially and metaphorically. And I began to apprehend the ways notions of invasive others overlap at the level of metaphor and physical violence. And at the same time that all of this was unfolding, plant scientists from India and Pakistan were meeting at the border to bilaterally engage and discuss how to manage what they call a transboundary pest. And transboundary pest is an official terminology used by multiple countries and the United Nations. And I think, so as part of this research, I was interviewing plant scientists about how they made sense of the ways that locusts were crossing these borders, which are highly militarized, but people couldn't. And there was a taken for grantedness around the way that, well, that's a silly question. How could locusts stop at borders? They fly, they're insects. They don't have to have visas. So I think that's an interesting response and kind of reveals some of the ways that we naturalize borders for humans and passports and so on. And I want to dwell, and I can talk more about that later, and I want to dwell a moment on this terminology of transboundary pest, because I think it's implicit. There's an implicit recognition of the fact that pests or animals are transboundary. So in grappling with non-human animal movement, state actors have to confront the artifice and imposition of their borders. There are many of these kind of transnational organizations that deal with cross-border animal movement, and this is an interesting tension. But because I want to kind of wrap up, I want to leave us with two questions to think about. One is, as I mentioned earlier, how do we naturalize borders for humans and animals differently? But how can we also look to the non-human animal world for alternatives for how we organize ourselves as humans? And there are many lessons that anthropologists are thinking through from ecologists to think about the ways that some ecological concepts facilitate international cooperation. And one of those is from an anthropologist, Alina Kim, who talks about, in the context of spoonbill habitat in the DMZ, the Flyway Concept. So this is a concept from a flyway path. This is a concept from ecologists about the non-human animal migration paths that link sites and ecosystems in different countries and continents. So I'd be curious to talk more with my colleagues and think about, I know Arun mentioned recently that there was North American Invasive Species Awareness Week recently. To what extent, if we're thinking about human migration, do we also consider humans as invasive species? And what is it about the so-called natural world that lends itself to forms of recognition around awareness of invasive species? Thank you, and I look forward to talking more in the question and answer.
Natasha, thank you so much. We're going to move on to our final presentation by Wendy Wilford. Wendy, take it away. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Anurag. And thank you, Eleanor and the Migrations Initiative and all of the panelists for being here today. It's a fascinating discussion, and I know there's a lot more we could say, and I wish we were in a room together so we could continue the conversation. We have very little time. So what I want to do is to really quickly present two different spaces that I have worked in for a number of years in which I've encountered this term invasive or invasion. In many ways, these will be sort of orthogonal to the studies already presented, and in some ways there's really interesting overlap. The first one is in Brazil, and the second space is in the Galapagos Islands of Ecuador. In both of these places, the term invasive or invasion is used in ways that on the surface are intended to appear natural or apolitical, with justification in legal terms in the case of Brazil, or ecological terms in the case of the Galapagos. And I would say in both cases, it's particular groups of humans and the way those humans live on the land, including the plants and animals they husband. It's those groups of humans and their livelihoods that are considered invasive. And the term carries with it the suggestion that without proper management, these humans and all they bring with them will proliferate recklessly and choke out prior and even primordial claims to this piece of land. So you can see the real overlaps between the way that we talk about invasive in all of these different disciplines. In both Brazil and in Ecuador, the use of the term invasive is clearly shaped by social, economic, political circumstances, legal circumstances, and then in turn, they have clear social, economic, and political implications. Okay, so I'll start with Brazil, and I only have 4 minutes per case, but I can elaborate in the question and answers. I went to Brazil 29 years ago to study a social movement that was organizing groups of people to enter rural properties, usually in clandestine ways, late at night. Movement activists would establish encampments and petition the government, the state government, the federal government, for access to the land that they were on. This movement is the Movement of Rural Landless Workers, known by its acronym in Portuguese, the MST, or the Movimento Sem Terra, which means the Landless Movement. The MST was founded in 1984, and when I went to work with them, I went before grad school during my undergraduate. I went to work with them in 1993, and they were still a pretty small, obscure group organizing these land occupations around the country. But over the next 10 years, for a number of reasons, they became the largest rural social movement in Latin American history. They're still active today with approximately 1.5 million members on over 1,200 land reform settlements. It's a little bit hard to count all of these things. And those land reform settlements are properties that were successfully expropriated and then distributed to the rural poor, many of whom, but not all, are MST members. For those people who support the movement and the occupations, what the activists and their members are doing is carrying out land occupations, occupying land that should be distributed to the rural poor. For those who don't support the movement, what the activists and members are doing is carrying out land invasions, invading land that rightly belongs to an individual who had prior title to the land. So people who use this language of invasions argue that such acts are against the natural order of things, that they worked for their land, and if that land were given to the Sem Terra, or the landless, then the Sem Terra would be out of control. They would manage the land poorly, they would proliferate recklessly, both because new people would be drawn to the invasion by the scent of getting something without working for it, and because the Sem Terra would subdivide their properties over and over. They wouldn't be economically productive, so they would just subdivide, and therefore their children and their children's children would be on this land, and the invasion would grow until it had ruined the land. So I had many large landowners whose land had been taken by the government or whose land was under this invasion say to me in outrage, "These invasions are against the natural order of things." Like I said, how would you like it if someone walked into your house and said, "This is mine now"? And on the face of it, this latter argument and the designation of the MST land takings as invasions, it seems pretty compelling, particularly in the United States, where property rights are perceived as relatively unambiguous and sacrosanct. But the distinction between occupation and invasion in Brazilian land law goes back 500 years to Portuguese colonization. And there's ensuing, 500 years worth of deliberate confusion over the legal definition of land rights. So again, I don't have very much time, so I have to summarize this really complex, long history about which a lot has been written, really good material. But suffice to say that Brazil has one of the most unequal land ownership distributions in the world. So a land inequality Gini of 8.7, and in 2006, the bottom 50% of farms controlled just 2.3% of the arable land in the country, while the largest 5% of farms controlled almost 70%. That's not new. This concentration in land ownership dates back to the Portuguese colonization when King João III divided the newly claimed territory. He was to bring religion to this territory. It was divided into 15 captaincies and handed out to 13 men. So the Portuguese crown tried to control colonization and encourage settlement. Remember, they're a tiny country. They're trying to encourage productive settlement of this now huge new land. And they do so by employing a medieval system of royal land grants called Seis Marias, whereby land would be given only to people who would productively use it. Uncultivated land was supposed to return to the crown. This use clause, though, was regularly violated, you can probably imagine, not only because it was hard to enforce in this big territory, but also because the crown itself ended up awarding huge tracts of land to encourage men of means to settle the country. So over time, land law in Brazil has come to enshrine two competing principles. On the one hand, there's strong protection for property rights, particularly in the civil code. And on the other hand, the federal constitution maintains this older concern for the social function of land, where land is supposed to be used for the good of the Brazilian people. So the civil code is conservative in the sense that existing property titles or rights are assumed to have been properly earned. And if you know anything about Brazilian land occupation, you know that that is a very dangerous assumption. But this is, as our own Eduardo Penalver says, the path dependency of property law in most countries, and nowhere more so than in Brazil. The Constitution is more forward-looking and normative than the Civil Code, particularly the latest Constitution drafted in 1988. And as such, the Constitution is empowered to imagine the land tenure regime that best serves the interests of the country. So when MST activists organize people to occupy unproductive land, they justify this as their constitutional right. They argue that the land they are occupying is not productive and therefore is held improperly. But landlords and often the local judges refer to the act of occupation as one of invasion, arguing again that this violates the natural order of things where their hard work earned them their property and the function of the state is to protect that right. They argue, as I said in the beginning, that the poor who take over would not manage the land correctly. They would proliferate unsustainably and recklessly, having no real inhibition and multiplying in direct and unthinking response to the availability of additional space. So again, the parallel to invasive species in an ecological sense. So there's a lot more to say there, but just that parallel is partly what I wanted to point out, and how difficult it is to be able to tease apart invasion from occupation. Okay, my second, even more brief example is from the Galapagos Islands of Ecuador. Most of you will be familiar with the very famous flora, charismatic flora and fauna of the islands, much of which is endemic and unique. The islands come under Ecuadorian possession in 1832, but it's only really after World War II that the government begins to colonize the islands in earnest. The government offers prospective settlers, mostly farmers, fishermen, farmers, tools like guns and zinc sheeting for housing for their roofs, seeds, and 100 hectares of land each on the islands. So the farmers they go slowly at first, and then they go in greater and greater numbers. Over the next several decades, however, the islands become increasingly important as sites of ecological preservation and conservation. So this is probably the Galapagos. We know people are always surprised to hear that there are over 30,000 people who live on the islands, because in 1959, the Galapagos National Park was created, and in 1964, the research station, and then in 78, they were designated a World Heritage Site by UNESCO. The protected areas of the islands and the marine reserve, or what is referred to as the Galapagos National Park, now constitutes 97% of the terrestrial and marine surface of the region, with the remaining 3% eligible for habitation. With this move towards a site of universal ecological value, the original farmers sent to the islands in the 1950s now felt that they were enemy number one. So when the park was established, many farmers lost farmland and they lost common areas for pasturing. The new park borders were drawn in ways that made sense on a map, right, as hard, solid lines, but they didn't necessarily make sense for life on the ground, whether human or non-human, as plants and animals regularly crossed those lines. So that border had to be policed, with park rangers perambulating the border between park and inhabited space on a regular basis. Over time, several agricultural plants were designated as invasive species on the island, including blackberry and guava. And there isn't a lot of disagreement that both blackberry and guava were invasive and are on the islands, but rather that the drawing of strict lines between protected and inhabited land and between invasive and endemic species was perhaps not the best way to manage the local environment. Instead, that strict separation resulted in violent clashes between local residents, the farmers. There were clashes with other types of occupations, so fishermen particularly. But in this case, I'm talking about farmers on the one hand, clashing with park rangers and scientists on the other. Farmers felt that they were treated as the problem, that they were criticized both for what they did, which was introducing non-native species and clearing land for those species to propagate, and they were criticized for what they didn't do. So they were criticized for not producing sufficient food, so that most of the food for the islands had to be brought in by container ships, and those containers were a major source of invasive introduction. Scientists and policymakers, on the other hand, felt that they had to control ecological invasions or be overrun by their natural propensity to multiply. In all of this pretty heated debate, there was definitely slippage as to whether the invasive species were the plants or the people themselves, because they were so closely tied together. Clashes between local residents and park managers and scientists became so persistent that on April 10th, 2007, the Ecuadorian government announced a state of emergency, and 4 months later, UNESCO placed the islands on the endangered list for World Cultural Heritage Sites. But the story takes a positive turn, and here I'm finishing up. Over the last 10 to 15 years, and it's been a few years since it's been a while since I've been to the islands, but over the last 10 or 15 years, a new approach to land management had increasingly taken hold. So due to a variety of reasons that I could go into, farmers were increasingly coming to be seen as part of the solution rather than just the problem, with the idea that perhaps the way to manage species interaction is by creating diverse novel landscapes that integrate endemic and non-endemic species. So coffee is being planted in the shade of endemic Scalesia trees, and the strict line between park and inhabited area is being replaced with farmer-managed spaces. So orange groves were one potential solution, and other ways of organizing species interaction in a management zone around the inhabited region, between inhabited region and the park. The new park management program in 2010 called for a shift of the imaginary boundaries between rural and protected areas. And as one ranger said to us, my research colleagues and myself in 2010, we are now a park that supports production, or a kind of hybrid landscape. So just to wrap up then, I think that the way in which the term invasive travels between humans and non-humans and between disciplines is fascinating. And at a minimum suggests that we should all understand the weight of the words we choose and the way in which they can be political or politicized in different contexts. I think the term invasive is blunt at best and deeply problematic at worst, whether applied to humans or non-humans. It's something that has to be used, I think, very carefully. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. Wow, what an amazing set of talks. I think we should get right into it with some of the questions from the audience and some of the things that have bubbled up. And I'll just start with the following, which is there's clearly a political side to invasiveness, no matter what the context, I suppose. And a word I don't think we heard from the speakers today was the word naturalized, which I guess in my area of biology and ecology, for non-indigenous species that are no longer invasive, we often use the term naturalized. And I think my parents were naturalized citizens of the US when they immigrated from India. So I guess I'm going to toss this first to David and then to Natasha for initial comments on the usefulness or problematic nature of changing how we view non-indigenous species from invasive to naturalized.
Yeah, thanks, Anurag. I guess I'd like to take the opportunity first to sort of answer a question Natasha asked, which I just don't want to leave hanging out there, which is, are humans invasive species? And from the perspective that I laid out from the definitions used in policy, the answer can only be no, because the very definition of harm, which is the core of the version of invasive that's used in policy, it's harm perceived, measured by humans. So that's a question that in the policy context in which I work, it's not a question that makes sense. Now, I don't mean to suggest that it wasn't a question you should have posed. I think it sort of gets us into this issue of the way in which the same words are used differently, even within biology, and then across disciplines. So part of where we've gone in this conversation is about semantics, which can be critically important. As Wendy, you just ended up saying, we got to be careful how we use our words. But we also have to be careful not to assume that just because we use the same word, that it means the same thing to someone else. So it's just incumbent on all of us in our various intellectual domains to be careful about and specify what we mean. But so this, and so Anurag, to your question, naturalized. Yes, these are species that are non-indigenous, but not seen to be harmful. Even if they may once have been seen to be harmful, they're no longer seen that way by the humans in that area that we're talking about. So it's a useful term in biology. It's and it's, as you say, it's been applied to people. I'm not sure whether that's problematic or not.
Yeah, thank you, David, and thank you, Anurag, for the question. I think I would just briefly say that, about the kind of utility of the word naturalization, instead of making an assessment of that, I think I would rather just point to how might our answer about the utility of the word naturalization again center human species. And I want to point out, too, that I think part of the comments I was making suggest that the human is not a generic category. Even though we are one species, we are differentiated and stratified. And so across the human, there may be certain stakeholders that benefit from this language and the kind of deployment of it. And in the context of, I think it's really great to bring us all together because there is a conundrum because we use the same words, but we may be using them differently. But I think what the anthropologist and environmental humanities perspective is trying to suggest is that the way the same words are used in different arenas overlap. And there may be some intersections, and naturalization is one word, for example, that kind of speaks to the way that these words overlap in different arenas. So I'll leave it there. I want to hear more from others.
Thanks, Natasha. Wendy, do you have comments about this or other things that have been bubbling in the conversation?
Yeah, I guess I wanted to sort of reiterate in response to your question, Anurag, but or maybe it's not directly in response, but part of the difficulty is that when we label a species as invasive, a plant, a non-human species, they're often associated with human activity. And then the danger is that although we have not named those humans invasive, a set of practices that are associated with proliferation then become under attack, right? So it's a recognition that the designation of harm is one that is set by certain individuals. And so it's always then going to be in part a political act. And I think, David, for me, one plant that brings that up, and one that you referenced in your opening, is maybe any of our really 6 biggest commodity crops, right, that are planted in much of this farming land in this country, but really that dominate the world and have had incredibly positive benefits in terms of contribution to food and fiber or fuel, but also potentially very negative consequences in terms of ecosystems, right? So I think of soy, you mentioned that as not an invasive species. It isn't native to the United States, and it is one that has cleared significant habitat and brought harm, potentially, we could argue, to that habitat. So I just wonder, can you talk more about how certain crops, because of their economic value, that ecological harm is overlooked, and how do we make that estimation?
Really hard conundrums, right? I think I heard sort of 2 questions. The first thing I'd say is, yes, deciding which species are harmful is political to the extent that any decision that a bunch of humans make, whether it's a selective bunch of humans or a representative bunch of humans, is political. And so what I'm trying to do is frame the science in the context of policy, because if the goal is to reduce harm, you have to decide which species are you going to focus resources on to reduce. What I think is missing what I wish had been made explicit in the US policy, for example, and I think this applies to many other nations too, is that I really think there's an important word missing before harm in the policy, and it's got to be net harm. Because there are many species that bring huge benefits and also cause harms, of course, like soybeans and cow, all the species that I mentioned that I said weren't invasive. Of course, they can be, and they do cause harm. Agriculture, it requires trade-offs. So I think in this policy context, what you have to think about is risk assessment. What are the benefits? What are the harms? And which species in a democratic decision-making process do we want to focus attention on? So I'd put this is a policy that I'd only be comfortable with in a democracy, and imperfect ones at best. But yes, it's humans that make the decisions.
Christopher, would you like to make a comment about this before we move on to the next? And don't feel obligated, but.
No, I don't feel obligated. I could say a lot, but I think there are many other questions out there that some of the audience members would like to hear aired.
Very good. Eleanor posed a question in the chat, and I'm going to let her ask that directly. Go ahead, Eleanor.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me back on. Almost everyone on the panel has mentioned colonization or colonialism in one way, although, of course, in very different contexts. And so my question is a big one, I realize, but I wanted to just invite you all to say a little bit more about how you think about the significance of looking at colonial history as a way of understanding some of the contemporary issues of migration and questions of invasive and native and some of these other terms that have come up. And I'm interested in the very different answers that you might pose to a question like this. So I guess I could turn it to Wendy first, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a great question, and that coloniality plays on many different levels here, right? So there's both a sense that introduction has something fundamentally to do with colonial conquest, right? And so there's the imposition of a particular way of living on the land. And if, as David says quite rightly, that it's humans who make this decision as to what belongs and what doesn't, then that decision is in a sense, one that has this very colonial history and colonial set of politics. I think there's also a way in which the search for endemic and what belongs or what is natural is not a perfect science, right? And so even if we decide we are going to leave this to the quote unquote, life scientists or ecologists, it isn't that we know exactly which species, belonged in which niches or in which places and have perfect access to that in order to repopulate, in order to protect or defend. And so even the sort of taking on the mantle of ecological warriors or saviors, which is a good thing, right, for protecting necessary species or valuable species, that sort of protection does have this sense of we're deciding what kind of landscapes are best for whom and under what conditions. Right. So preserving, working in the Galapagos Islands, there was definitely a sense that you were preserving an original landscape, but really trying to keep a living laboratory that could be dated back to Darwin's time. And there was a very, I would say, Western scientific sense of what that value was. Right. And so the people who go to the Galapagos Islands did tend to be people who were people of means, because it's really expensive, unless you're Ecuadorian. So the government was trying to get Ecuadorians to go and making it much cheaper. But in fact, it was people for whom these islands spoke a certain kind of truth to, right? Some kind of primordial ecological history. So I'm not sure I answered your question in all of its richness, Eleanor, but I think there's definitely a colonial aspect to the way in which this knowledge of invasion is deployed.
Just echo.
Yeah, can I jump in on that one? That was very well said, Wendy. And in the ecological side of things, colonists, colonialism, to some extent, if you say, well, this plant or this bird first colonized Hawaii, for instance, it sort of implies that it was a virgin territory, that there was nothing else there. And everything else that happens after that colonization is not given much attention. And assume if it was there first and it deserves to be there first, and anything that would limit that organism then is inappropriate tinkering or whatever with nature. So the way in which we use it in ecology is a little bit different than the way it's used in the social sciences and political sciences, but I think it still has the sense that we were here first, or we beat you and we deserve to be here and you don't, this sort of thing. Part of the other issue with some of this is colonization and quote unquote natural systems happens all the time. We have species coming and species going over the long term, over geological time. And some people in the conservation community have this tendency to try to want to limit some of that. And that's one reason we're concerned about invasive species to some extent, because it's upsetting the biodiversity and the species complement in an area. But by the same token, this has happened over geological time. And so the tendency for some areas of conservation science is to try to keep ecological systems quote unquote static. So that elasticity that I referred to earlier, we try to limit that as much as possible. And so now we have these natural areas that are quote unquote museums, whatever the case may be. And we also forget the fact that there's been a long history of coevolution, and I mean that literally, coevolution between humans and nature. They have impacted one another over the course of human history. And so we have this tendency to talk about nature and what's going on in the natural world apart from us. To some extent, there's value in that, but also value in remembering that we are a part of nature in many ways, and that we need to make that reconnection. And maybe that will allow us then to make that reconnection to be better stewards of it.
Thank you, Christopher. I guess before we move on, if Natasha, you have comments, and if not, then David, and then I'll move to the next question.
No, go ahead, David.
Very good. This one comes from the audience. How do the rights of other species play into the discussion? When do adverse impacts on other plant and animal species outweigh benefits to humans? And to that, I'd even benefits to other species. Sometimes we have non-indigenous species that come into play that benefit native species, let alone. So, David, you're shaking your head. Do you want to chime in there first?
Oh, sure. I mean, I'll just say, yeah, we welcome lots of non-indigenous species into the U.S. and many other countries do as well. We already talked about soybeans and the obvious reasons why that's true. I think you have to see it in terms of weighing potential costs and potential benefits, and it's not, for many species, it's easy. There are no advocates. There are no human advocates. For other species, it's complicated. And for other species, there's lots of human advocates. And so it's easy to let them in. It's just I don't think it's simple. It's definitely not the case that in this kind of policy context, lines are artificially drawn as something that hasn't ever been here is not desirable. There are biologists who might take that approach, but that's not the approach that's put into policy.
Comments, Natasha?
I could say something. I think that's it's very difficult, and I would suggest that perhaps one of the limits in how we're thinking about benefits for a species for humans versus, as the question asks, what if something benefits another species? I think we're so limited in thinking of species as discrete and discretely having a set of benefits and a set of harm and calculating them against each other. And it would be interesting if we had models to kind of calculate relational benefits and thinking about processes of parasitism or something in the ways that we require and interdepend on each other as a multi-species world.
Anurag, could I just pipe in one more thing? I think your question was about, and Natasha just mentioned, the way that some non-human species might benefit some other non-human species. The problem is that the decisions are always made by humans. So it's up to us humans to figure out what those relationships among other organisms are and how we value them, and then how that's reflected in policy or management decisions.
Thank you. Wendy, go ahead.
I think there are some interesting and potentially quite inspiring examples of nature having rights. So I think the question from the audience was, what about the rights of other species than humans? And Ecuador, for example, with their new constitution and the idea that nature has specific rights laid out in the constitution, and that was just put to the test with probably the first ever victory for a cloud forest to not be mined by, I think it was an oil company. So it's an interesting experiment, and I think an important one for us to think outside of our anthropocentric framework, given that we have done so much to bring ruin, to the climate and to the planet, that perhaps a different, as Natasha says, multi-species, but even decentering further, right, and thinking about the rights of other species.
That's really interesting. And Switzerland also has coded some of that kind of philosophy into their constitution as well. And there's a river in Canada that's been granted personhood. And so there's a lot of this happening around the world. But I wanted to get back a little bit to, I don't know if this is off topic or not, but it has to do with harm and versus value and this sort of thing. And I know there are a number of my colleagues in the conservation field who are not as upset as others are about some of these wetland weeds that are invading areas of the East Coast, like Phragmites, the reed canary grass, and it's crowding out some of the other native species. But they suggest that, yes, there's a lot more of this invasive grass in these areas, but they're performing a very valuable ecological function. And so we need to be looking at what is the ecological function that they're performing, rather than looking at a list of species that maybe were there 50 years ago versus now, and not just looking at the species list and saying, well, this one's gone, so this is a bad thing. This non-native species is actually performing some valuable ecological function. And I'm not saying I subscribe to this, but it's just part of the argument and the conundrum that we're facing.
Yeah, agreed. I'll pose a final question that was from the audience. And the question is that humans have been traveling and moving across the continents forever, or for as long as they have been. Is there a fundamental difference between the species that were moved then, perhaps at that slower rate than we see now, and how we treat them compared to those that are moving now and moving more rapidly? I'm going to ask David for a quick answer so that I know we're almost out of time, and then we'll pass it very quickly.
Yeah, qualitatively, the difference is that we're connected. Any one place on the planet is connected to different places than we were in previous generations because of globalization. Quantitatively, it's different because it's happening so much more quickly and so many more species.
Mm-hmm. Natasha, do you have a comment?
Just briefly, I'll say, yeah, I think that these are longstanding questions, and that the contemporary kind of acceleration and pace at which these things are happening raise new ones.
Wendy?
No, just to say thank you to all of the panelists and to you, Anurag, for moderating, and to say I think it's probably clear that a system for managing invasive, non-invasive, naturalized introductions has probably not worked very well, as David said in his opening, right? We have maybe not done as well with managing these as we could, and that perhaps a whole different way of thinking about managing these interactions, sort of along the lines that Natasha brought up, might be very welcome.
Wonderful. Well, I don't think we're going to take another question. I think our time is close to up. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in.